Week 10 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few plays I look to buy and trade for this week. The first player, DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think it's been a decent season for him in his first year with the Steelers. And I've said this in other videos. Usually Aaron Rodgers is number one target and receiver in his offense. Usually have good fantasy seasons. But the last 2 out of 3 weeks, he's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points as Metcalf in PPR leagues. Week 6 versus the Browns, 4 catches, 95 yards, a touchdown. 9 targets. Week 7 at Cincinnati, 3 catches, 50 yards. Week 8 versus Green Bay, 5 catches, 55 yards, a touchdown. And Week 9 versus the Colts in the victory, 2 catches, 6 yards, only 4 targets. So like I said, targets haven't been great for DK Metcalf, but he is the number one option easily in the passing game for this Pittsburgh Steelers team. I know he's been a touchdown-dependent wide receiver, but him and Rodgers still working on things. I know it's Week 10 of the season. These guys had training camp, obviously preseason a little bit, through 9 weeks of the season to work together. But DK Metcalf, we know he's capable of making big plays and making things happen. Coming off of 2 out of 3 bad games, and especially in Week 9, 2 for 6 versus a mediocre Indianapolis defense. He's definitely a player to go out there and buy this week. The next player, Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. So Sutton, he's still been okay over the last few weeks, but definitely the numbers dropped off. And he's not putting up elite numbers, just mediocre numbers the last few weeks. Week 7 versus the Giants, 6 catches, 87 yards, a 2-point conversion. Week 8 versus the Cowboys, 4 for 67. And Week 9 at Houston, only 1 catch, 30 yards on a touchdown down the sideline. So Week 10, a good matchup coming up here versus division rival, the Vegas Raiders. They can't stop anyone. Is this Raider defense? We just saw Jacksonville go out there, put up 30 points versus them in their own building in Week 9. So Sutton, definitely mediocre to poor games over the last few weeks. Like I said, where he's not getting a lot of targets, Bo Nix spreading the football out, and obviously the running backs and J.K. Dobbins and Harvey are playing good football. So right now with all those factors, and his ceiling hasn't been high, he's a buy low play this week. Next player buys Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears. So Rome Odunze, the last few weeks, the numbers haven't been there for Odunze, but still I think he's the number one option in this passing game. I know DJ Moore, he had a big game in the Week 9 victory at the Cincinnati Bengals, and it's hard to believe Odunze had 3 targets and no fantasy points for the Chicago Bear team. 47-point performance that they put up. So the last few weeks for Odunze, like I said, he's really struggled besides 1 good game at Baltimore. Week 6 at Washington, 2 catches, 32 yards. Week 7 versus New Orleans Saints, 2 catches, 31 yards in that game. And Week 8 at Baltimore, 7 catches, 114 yards, 10 targets. In Week 9 at Cincinnati, only 3 targets, and he didn't catch a pass in that one. So he's definitely struggling right now, is Rome Odunze. I still think he's a wide receiver that he can help fantasy owners as the season goes on. And I got a good matchup coming up here Week 10 versus the New York Giants. So like I said, he's struggling right now, and this offense is still putting up numbers where he's only had 1 double-digit fantasy game in the last 4 games for Rome Odunze. He's definitely a play I would buy this week. Next play I would look to buy Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. Flowers, he's been on this list a few times this season. Now with Lamar back in the offense, obviously they put on a show in Miami, even though that was a slam dunk matchup. In Week 10, a pretty decent matchup coming up here at the Minnesota Vikings. Even though I thought the Vikings in Week 9, for the most part, did a good job versus a very high-powered offense in the Detroit Lions. So the last few weeks here, for Zay Flowers, 6 versus the Rams, 6 catches, 46 yards, a fumble loss, 10 targets. Week 8 versus the Bears, a carry, 8 yards, 7 catches, 63 yards, 9 targets. And Week 9 at the Dolphins, 5 catches, 64 yards. He's had double-digit fantasy games 3 in a row with Zay Flowers, and going back to 5 in a row games, but nothing popping off the game log where he's scoring anywhere from 12, 14 fantasy points. And obviously in an offense with Derrick Henry, Lamar Jackson, those guys are going to run the football a whole lot. And even Mark Andrews at the tight end position, where he's obviously a big red zone threat. His numbers week in and week out aren't going to be consistent, but I think Zay Flowers could be a big play receiver. I know Week 1 was his best game of the season, where he had a monster game, 28 fantasy points, 7 catches, 143 yards, and a touchdown on 9 targets, but still consistently putting up wide receiver 2/wide receiver 3 numbers. And this week, in a matchup in Minnesota, I think he could go out there, Flowers, have a good ball game, and he's a buy low play this week. Next player, Jordan Mason of the Minnesota Vikings. A lot of people, they were writing Jordan Mason off, but once again now Aaron Jones, he's banged up with a shoulder sprain. We'll see if he's going to play. But Aaron Jones, his best years are behind him. And Jordan Mason, I think, is a talented running back in this offense. He just needs, a consistent 15, 20 touches a game to get his numbers. So the last few weeks, week 7 versus Philly, 15 carries, 57 yards, a touchdown. Week 8 at the Chargers, 4 carries, 3 yards, a catch, 3 yards. And then week 9 at Detroit, he got 10 carries, 36 yards, a catch for a yard. So week 10, good matchup on paper versus Baltimore, 4th most fantasy points to running backs on the season. Like I said, Aaron Jones, he got hurt in that game at Detroit with the shoulder injury, the AC joint, and we don't know if he's going to play him this week. But like I said, I think Jones' best days are behind him. And Mason, we saw what he was capable of last season, filling in for Christian McCaffrey majority of the season. So right now, well, his numbers aren't great, but also he could be in line to be the bell cow back if Jones is going to miss time. He's definitely a player to trade for this week. The next player, J.K. Dobbins of the Denver Broncos. So Dobbins still the leader in this backfield. I know in terms of fantasy football, the last 2 weeks, R.J. Harvey has put up better numbers, obviously, in stats with 4 touchdowns. In 2 games, it's been for Harvey, but still Dobbins, he's going out there, and he's getting 15, 18 touches per game the last few weeks for Dobbins. Week 7 versus the Giants, 14 carries, 81 yards, a catch, -1 yards. Week 8 versus the Cowboys, 15 carries, 111 rush yards, 2 catches, 10 yards. And week 9 at Houston, 15 carries, 61 yards, a catch, -2 yards. So like I said, 15, 18 touches per game Dobbins is getting. Still physical in between the tackles, where Harvey's more third down, passing downs back. And this week, a great matchup coming up versus the Vegas Raiders, where their defense just gave up over 150 yards on the ground to the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think Dobbins, he's a buy low candidate. I know not a high ceiling, but still a guy, 12, 15 fantasy points, more weeks than not. He's going to go out there and give fantasy owners. And coming off a poor game, though, with 6.9 fantasy points, even though yards per carry wise, he rushed the football well in that game, was Dobbins. He's a buy low player this week. And the final player, Tyler Warren of the Indianapolis Colts. It might be tough for fantasy owners to go out there and buy Warren, where arguably he's the number 1 option in this passing game, even though the numbers have tailed off over the last 2 weeks, where he's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points in that time. But he's a matchup problem. They line him up all over the field, is this Indianapolis Colts team. And like I said, though, coming off of 2 bad games, sent some feelers out there, but still, I think it's going to be tough for owners to pry him away in a deal on a little bit of a discount. Week 7 at the Chargers, 4 catches, 69 yards, a touchdown. Week 8 versus Tennessee, 4 catches, 53 yards. And week 9, 5 catches, 26 yards on 7 targets. It was just a bad game overall. Daniel Jones had 5 turnovers, and this Steelers defense went out there and played. And you would think all season long, with all the talent they have on that defense, they would go out there, have similar performances like they did in week 9. So coming off of 2 mediocre to poor games for Tyler Warren, and a good matchup coming up versus Atlanta. And then week 11 a bye. He's definitely a player to buy this week. So that's a few players I look to buy and trade for week 10 of the fantasy football season.